The airport was loud, crowded, and full of voices blending into one endless echo. People rushed past with rolling suitcases, phones pressed to their ears, eyes fixed on departure screens. No one paid attention to the small elderly woman sitting quietly in the corner near the check-in counters. She sat on a metal bench holding her worn brown handbag close to her chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked around, trying to make sense of the chaos that surrounded her. Every few minutes, an announcement played through the speakers. Flight delays, boarding calls, gate changes. But the woman couldn't hear a single word. She watched the movement of lips and saw the lights blink on the screen, yet nothing reached her ears. She was deaf. Her eyes darted from one person to another, hoping someone might notice her confusion. But everyone seemed too busy, lost in their own world. She stood up slowly, holding her ticket close to her face, trying to read the gate number. Her hands shook. She tried to ask a man in a suit for help, pointing at her ticket, then at the large screen across the hall. The man frowned, said something quickly, and walked away. She didn't understand him, but his reaction told her enough. He wasn't going to help. Another woman nearby gave her a polite smile and hurried off. The old woman's shoulders sank as she sat back down. Her eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. She wasn't asking for much, just for someone to guide her to the right gate. But in that busy terminal, she felt invisible. A few rows away, a man sat with his young daughter eating sandwiches they had packed from home. They were waiting for their delayed flight, just like many others. The little girl was cheerful and talkative, asking her father endless questions about airplanes, clouds, and where people go when they travel. Her father smiled, answering patiently, though his eyes showed the tiredness of a long day. While unwrapping another sandwich, the girl suddenly stopped talking. She was looking past her father, toward the lonely woman sitting by herself. The girl tugged at her father's sleeve and whispered softly, asking why the old lady looked so sad. Her father turned his head, following his daughter's gaze. That's when he noticed her. The trembling hands, the way she tried to communicate but no one responded. He looked closer and realized she was using her hands in a specific way, moving her fingers in small motions. Then it hit him. She was signing. Memories flashed through his mind. Years ago, his late wife had been a sign language interpreter. She had taught him a few signs, simple ones, so he could understand the basics when she practiced. He hadn't used those signs in years, but somehow they never left him. He looked back at his daughter, who was still staring at the woman. "Should we help her?" she asked quietly. The man didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath and stood up, leaving his bag on the chair. His daughter followed closely, clutching her small stuffed toy in her hand. As they approached, the old woman looked up in surprise. Her eyes widened slightly, unsure what they wanted. The man smiled kindly and gestured toward her ticket. Then slowly he raised his hands and signed, "Are you okay?" It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The woman's face changed instantly. The worry in her eyes melted into relief. For the first time all day, someone understood her. She began signing back quickly, her movements shaky at first, then smoother as she realized he was following along. She explained that her flight had been changed, but she couldn't hear the announcements. She didn't know where to go now, and no one had taken the time to help. He nodded gently and signed, "Let me see your ticket." She handed it to him with trembling hands. He read it carefully and checked the screen nearby. The gate number had indeed changed. It was all the way across the terminal. He looked back at her and signed, "Come with me. I'll help you." She looked up, her eyes filled with gratitude, and stood slowly. He picked up her small bag to help her carry it. His daughter walked beside them, looking up curiously at the woman's hand movements. The woman smiled at the little girl, then pointed to her toy and signed something playful. The girl didn't understand but laughed anyway, sensing the kindness in her gesture. As they walked together through the busy airport, people turned to look, not because of who they were, but because of the strange yet beautiful silence between them, a conversation happening entirely without sound. The old woman's hands moved gracefully, and the man responded with small nods, smiles, and careful signs. It was a language of patience and empathy, one most people there had probably never seen up close. At one point, they stopped near the information desk to double-check the flight details. The man wrote the new gate number on the back of the woman's ticket and showed her the way. She thanked him over and over again through signs, tears forming in her eyes. He kept reassuring her with small gestures. "It's okay. You're safe. Don't worry. His daughter watched everything closely, her young mind quietly learning what real kindness looked like. Once they reached the right gate, the old woman sat down, visibly calmer. The man asked through signs if she wanted something to drink. She shook her head and smiled warmly, touching her heart, a gesture that meant, "Thank you." Then she began to sign something more personal. Slowly, she told him about her son. Her signs were soft and filled with emotion. She explained that he was successful, busy, always traveling for work. She loved him deeply but hardly saw him anymore. She signed that sometimes success makes people forget the small things that matter, like sitting down to listen or just saying, "I miss you." The man nodded, understanding more than her words. He had lost his wife a few years ago, and he too knew how easy it was for life to drift away from what truly matters. For a moment, they simply sat there, two strangers connected by something that didn't need sound. His daughter leaned on his arm, smiling at the woman, who smiled back warmly. As the boarding call flashed on the screen, the man pointed to the gate and nodded. The woman looked at it, then at him, realizing it was time for her to go. She stood up slowly, her small frame shaking with emotion. Before leaving, she reached out, gently holding his hand for a second. Then she signed, "You remind me of my husband. He was kind like you." The man smiled, touched by her words. He signed back, "He must have been a good man." She nodded, her eyes glistening. Before walking away, she leaned down to the little girl and touched her cheek softly, signing, "You have a kind heart." The girl smiled, not fully understanding but feeling the warmth behind those gestures. The woman waved, then slowly joined the line to board her plane. The man and his daughter stood there watching her until she disappeared down the jet bridge. Around them, people still hurried, phones still rang, announcements still echoed. But for that small moment, it felt peaceful. The man felt something stir in his chest, not sadness but quiet gratitude. His daughter slipped her hand into his and said softly, "I'm glad we helped her." He looked down, smiling, and said, "Me too." They went back to their seats and waited for their flight, but his mind stayed with the woman. He thought about how many people must have walked past her, pretending not to see. It made him realize how easy it is for people to overlook someone just because they don't fit into the noise of everyday life. He couldn't help but wonder what her story really was, who her son was, where she was going, and whether she'd tell him about the stranger who had stopped to help. The terminal slowly grew quieter as more flights departed. The man sat back and closed his eyes for a moment, hearing his daughter hum softly beside him. Somewhere in another terminal, the old woman was now seated on her plane, thinking about the kind man and his little girl who had spoken to her through their hands, the language of care and understanding that needs no sound. Neither of them knew that this small moment, this simple act of helping, would soon circle back in a way they never expected. But for now, in that busy airport filled with strangers, one small act of kindness had made a world of difference for someone who just wanted to be seen. The plane took off and the noise of its engines faded into the night sky. The old woman looked out of the window, her hands resting gently on her lap. She smiled faintly as the city lights below turned into tiny dots. For the first time that day, she felt calm. Her heart was still full from the kindness she had received at the airport. She thought about the man and his little daughter, about how they had helped her when no one else did. A small act of compassion had turned her loneliness into peace. She looked down at her boarding pass again, running her fingers across the crumpled paper. The name of her destination brought a quiet excitement to her heart. She was flying to visit her son, someone she hadn't seen in months. He was a busy man, always surrounded by meetings, decisions, and people who called him sir. But to her, he was still just her boy. She had raised him on her own after losing her husband many years ago. Life hadn't been easy, but she never complained. She worked late nights sewing clothes, saving every bit to send him to school. She used to tell him that kindness would take him further than money ever could. He had promised to remember that. But as the years went by and success took over, she sometimes wondered if he still did. Meanwhile, back at the terminal, the man and his daughter were finally boarding their own flight. The girl held his hand tightly as they walked down the jet bridge. She couldn't stop talking about the lady they had helped. She kept asking questions about where the woman was going, if she had anyone waiting for her, and if they would ever see her again. The man smiled softly, answering each question with patience. Though deep down he didn't know any of the answers himself. Once they settled into their seats, the little girl leaned against him and said, "You always say the world is busy, but today I saw that not everyone has to be." He looked at her with a proud smile, gently brushing her hair back. "You're right," he said quietly. "Sometimes the world just needs one person to stop and care." They flew through the night, unaware that their paths with the old woman were not finished yet. The next morning, in another city, the old woman arrived at her destination. The moment she stepped out of the airport, she spotted a familiar driver waiting with a small sign that had her name on it. He waved and greeted her kindly, then helped her with her bags. She couldn't hear his words, but she smiled and nodded politely. The drive to her son's house was long, and she spent it looking out the window, thinking about how much he must have changed since the last time they met. Her son lived in a large modern home, the kind with tall glass walls and a neatly trimmed garden. When the car stopped, a few workers opened the gate and helped her out. Her son's assistant came rushing out to greet her. The woman smiled warmly and reached out her hand in greeting, but the assistant only nodded, looking slightly nervous, unsure how to communicate with her. She stepped into the house and looked around. It was beautiful but strangely quiet. Everything looked perfect, almost too perfect, like a showroom. Her son wasn't home yet. The assistant explained through notes that he was at work but would be back soon. She nodded, took off her coat, and sat on the couch. Her heart filled with pride, but also a little sadness. It was strange how the house felt so different from the warmth she remembered when her son was young. That evening, her son finally came home. The door opened and he walked in, still talking on his phone. He was tall, confident, and dressed in an expensive suit. His expression changed the moment he saw his mother. He smiled, rushed to her, and gave her a hug. She could feel the love in that hug, even though she couldn't hear his words. He pulled back and started talking, forgetting for a moment that she couldn't hear. When he realized his smile faded awkwardly, he quickly pulled out his phone and typed a message to show her. "I missed you, Mom." She smiled and touched his face gently, signing back, "I missed you too, my boy." They spent the evening together, though most of the time he was still working. Every few minutes his phone rang or someone from his office sent a document to sign. She sat nearby quietly watching him. The house was full of things, fine furniture, awards, photos from conferences, but it lacked something she couldn't name. Maybe warmth, maybe time. Later that night, as they ate dinner together, she signed something that made him pause. "Do you still remember what I told you when you were little?" He frowned slightly, unsure. She smiled and signed again. "Kindness first, success later." He looked down at his plate, suddenly quiet. That phrase echoed in his mind. It had been years since he heard her say it. The next morning he drove her to his office building, a tall glass tower with his name on the front. He wanted to show her where he worked. As they entered the lobby, people greeted him respectfully. The staff whispered, glancing curiously at the woman walking beside their boss. Some smiled politely, others looked away, unsure of how to behave around someone who was deaf. The old woman noticed, but she didn't take it personally. She just smiled warmly at everyone she passed. He took her to his office in a big corner room with a view of the whole city. She walked around slowly, touching the plants, looking at the photos on his desk. One picture caught her eye. It was of him standing with several employees, all smiling. She pointed to it and signed, "They look happy." He nodded but didn't respond much. He was checking his phone again. While he was distracted, someone knocked on the door. It was his secretary, explaining that a man had come to deliver a package. The son nodded and said to let him in. A few seconds later, the office door opened, and in walked the same man who had helped his mother at the airport. He was wearing a delivery uniform now, carrying a box in his hands. His daughter wasn't with him. He was working his shift, trying to make ends meet. The moment the old woman saw him, her eyes widened in shock. She stood up quickly, smiling, tears welling in her eyes. The man looked up, equally surprised, recognizing her instantly. The son looked between them, confused. He had no idea what was happening. The old woman started signing excitedly to her son, her hands moving fast. He struggled to keep up, so she quickly wrote it on a piece of paper. The note said, "This man helped me at the airport." No one cared. He spoke to me in sign language. The son froze, reading those words again and again. His chest tightened with emotion. He looked at the man, realizing this was the stranger his mother had been talking about. He stood up slowly and extended his hand. The man hesitated, unsure why the CEO was offering a handshake, but he took it politely. The son's voice softened as he said, "Thank you for helping my mother." The man nodded modestly and said, "Anyone would have done the same." But deep down, they both knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have stopped that day. The old woman watched them, her heart swelling with pride. She signed to her son, "You see? The world still has good people. Don't ever forget that." The son looked at her for a long moment and then at the man again. He realized how easily he could have been one of those people who ignored her, too busy, too distracted, too self-centered. The thought hit him harder than he expected. After the man left, the son sat quietly in his chair, lost in thought. His mother reached across the desk and gently took his hand. She didn't need to say much, her touch said everything. For the first time in years, he saw clearly how much his success had distanced him from the simple goodness she had taught him. That evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, he sat with her on the balcony, both of them sharing a quiet moment. She signed softly, "I'm proud of you. But remember, no title, no company. No amount of money is worth more than kindness." He nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. He promised himself that night that he would never let his work make him forget what really mattered. The next morning, he called his team together and announced something that surprised everyone. He wanted to start a foundation that would help people with hearing disabilities find better opportunities. His mother smiled, her eyes shining. She knew that the lesson she had spent her whole life teaching had finally reached his heart again. And somewhere across the city, the man who had helped her finished his shift, unaware that his small act of kindness had just changed someone's life forever. The next few weeks felt different for the man at the top. For years, his days had followed the same routine: meetings, decisions, numbers, and deadlines. But ever since his mother's visit and the unexpected meeting with the delivery man, something inside him had changed. He started noticing the small things he had ignored for too long: the tired faces of his staff, the security guard who stood all day at the gate, the cleaner who quietly worked after hours. He began realizing that real success wasn't measured by money or fame, but by how people felt around you. One morning, as he sat by the window of his office sipping coffee, he thought about what his mother had told him again and again: kindness first, success later. Her words had taken root deep in his heart. That simple phrase now followed him everywhere. He could still picture her smiling when she said it, her hands gently moving through the air, each sign filled with love. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He decided to do something meaningful. He called his team together and announced his plan to start a new project, one that would help people with hearing loss find opportunities in workplaces that understood and supported them. Some of his executives were surprised. They weren't used to seeing this softer side of him, but his tone was calm and sincere. "This isn't charity," he told them. "This is about giving people a chance to be seen." He didn't just want to fund it. He wanted to be involved personally. He started visiting organizations that trained people in sign language. He sat through their lessons, learning the language his mother had used her entire life. At first, his movements were clumsy, his expressions unsure, but the teachers appreciated his effort. Slowly, he began signing better, and every time he practiced, he thought of his mother smiling somewhere, proud of him. Meanwhile, the man who had helped her at the airport continued living his simple life. His day started early and ended late. He worked hard, delivering packages across the city, taking care of his little daughter and doing whatever he could to give her a good future. He didn't know that his small act of kindness had started a ripple effect, far beyond his imagination. One afternoon, while he was making deliveries at an office building, a woman from the reception desk stopped him. "Sir," she said politely, "the CEO of this company would like to see you." He froze for a second, confused. "Me?" he asked. She nodded with a smile. "Yes, please follow me." He followed her up the elevator, unsure what to expect. When the doors opened, he found himself in a familiar place, the same tall glass building where he had once met the old woman and her son. He walked into the same office, his heart pounding slightly. The CEO stood up to greet him, but this time there was no formal distance in his voice. He smiled warmly and said, "It's good to see you again." The man nodded, still unsure why he was there. I didn't mean to bother you, he said softly. The CEO shook his head. You didn't bother me. I wanted to thank you properly. What you did for my mother. It reminded me of what kind of person I should be. The two men sat down, and the CEO explained his new project, the Foundation for People with Hearing Loss. He told him how it was inspired by that moment at the airport, by the kindness of a stranger who stopped when no one else did. You started this, he said sincerely. You reminded me what matters, and I want you to be part of it. The delivery man looked surprised. Me, I'm not a businessman. I just deliver packages, he said honestly. The CEO smiled. That's exactly why I want you. You understand people. You see what others ignore. I can teach you how things work here. But what you have in that heart, you can't teach that. He hesitated for a long moment, unsure if he was ready for something so big. But when he thought about his daughter and the life he wanted for her, he nodded slowly. I'll do my best, he said. From that day, everything started to change. He began working closely with the team, helping to design programs for deaf individuals, visiting schools and meeting families. His humble nature made everyone feel comfortable around him. He treated everyone equally, whether they were executives or workers. The CEO often watched him from a distance, realizing how natural kindness could be when it came from the heart. One day, the CEO invited his mother to visit the office again. When she arrived, everyone greeted her with warmth and respect. The place that once felt distant now seemed full of life. The CEO proudly showed her the new section of the building where sign language classes were being held for employees. She walked around, amazed to see people learning her language. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw her son signing fluently with a young employee. He turned to her and signed, I remember now. Mom, kindness first, she smiled, her hands trembling slightly as she signed back. You make me proud. Later, the man who had helped her walked into the room. The old woman immediately recognized him and walked forward, her face glowing with joy. She signed to him, You see, you changed more than one life. He smiled modestly and replied with simple signs he had learned. You changed mine too. They both laughed silently, their eyes saying more than words ever could. Over the next few months, the project grew faster than anyone expected. Dozens of companies joined in, offering jobs and training to people with hearing disabilities. It became a movement that touched hearts everywhere. Reporters started writing about it, calling it the language of kindness. But for the CEO, it was never about publicity. It was about honoring his mother and keeping her message alive. He often thought about how close he had come to losing sight of humanity. His mother's silence had spoken louder than any words could. He had once believed that power came from control, but now he understood that true strength came from compassion. And the person who reminded him of that wasn't a billionaire or a partner. It was a man who simply stopped to help a stranger at an airport. One evening, the CEO visited the man's small apartment. The daughter opened the door, surprised but excited to see such an important guest standing there. She called her father quickly. When he appeared, the CEO handed him a small envelope. Inside was a letter and a scholarship certificate for his daughter. She deserves a good education, the CEO said. You've done enough for others. Let me do something for you now. The man was speechless. He tried to refuse at first, but the CEO insisted. Please, this is not charity. This is gratitude. They sat down together, talking like old friends. The CEO asked about his wife, about his life, about his struggles. It was a long, honest conversation between two men who understood each other beyond social titles or wealth. When the CEO left, the man stood at the door for a long time, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, genuine hope. That night, as the city lights flickered outside, the man's daughter sat on the couch holding the scholarship paper. She looked up at her father and said, You see, Dad? Good things come back to good people. He smiled and nodded, his eyes moist. Maybe you're right, he whispered. Maybe kindness really does travel in circles. Back at his own home, the CEO sat beside his mother, who was resting on the couch, knitting quietly. He told her everything that had happened, how the project was growing, how the man and his daughter were doing well. She listened patiently, smiling. When he finished, she put down her knitting, looked at him, and signed something that made him emotional. I always knew you would find your way back to your heart. He leaned forward, taking her hands gently. I almost forgot, Mom, he signed slowly. But now I know. The world needs people who see others, not just walk past them. She smiled softly, tears in her eyes, and signed back. You finally understand what success really means. The room was quiet, filled with a peace that words couldn't describe. The sound of the city outside faded into the distance. The CEO looked at his mother and realized that everything he had built, the buildings, the wealth, the reputation, meant nothing compared to the simple happiness he saw in her eyes. Far away, in another part of the city, the man sat with his daughter, watching the stars through their small window. She leaned against him and asked, "Do you think that lady is happy now?" He smiled softly. "I think she is," he said. "And I think her son finally learned what she's been trying to tell him all along." The little girl smiled and whispered, "That's good." They sat there in silence, two people who had unknowingly changed a family, a company, and perhaps even the world, all because one person had stopped to care. And as the night deepened, two different homes, one grand and one humble, shared the same quiet feeling of peace, connected forever by a single act of kindness that needed no sound, only heart. Months passed, and life began to take a new shape for everyone involved. The city was changing quietly, one small act of kindness at a time. The foundation had grown beyond what anyone expected. What started as one man's way to honor his mother had now become a movement that connected hearts across distances. The CEO spent less time behind his desk and more time among people, visiting schools, shelters, and community centers. Everywhere he went, he saw faces light up when they realized someone finally cared. He often took his mother with him. Even though she couldn't hear the applause or the speeches, she could see the joy in people's eyes, and that was enough. She signed proudly to her son one day, "This is what your father would have wanted, to see you using your success to help others." He smiled, touched her hand gently, and signed back, "You're the one who taught me how." At one of the foundation's new programs, they were launching a special training center for people who were deaf or hard of hearing. The goal was to teach job skills, confidence, and communication tools for workplaces that often overlooked them. The man who had helped the old woman at the airport was now managing this center. His calm nature and genuine kindness made him perfect for the role. He didn't have a fancy degree, but he had something far more valuable: understanding. He greeted everyone with warmth, no matter who they were. He learned sign language fluently, so that he could communicate better with the trainees. His daughter often visited the center too. She loved sitting quietly, watching people use their hands to talk, to laugh, and to share stories without a single sound. It fascinated her. She started learning the language herself, practicing with the staff and showing off her new signs to her father each evening. The CEO sometimes dropped by unexpectedly, not as a boss, but as a listener. He'd sit with the trainees, watching how the program was helping them grow. Every time he came, his mother would come along. Everyone adored her. Her warm smile, her patience, and her soft way of encouraging people with just her eyes. She had become a symbol of the foundation itself, proof that even in silence, love can be the loudest voice. One afternoon, while visiting the training center, the CEO sat across from the man who now managed it. The two of them had become close, bound by respect. They often shared quiet conversations about life, family, and the meaning of success. That day, the CEO asked, "Do you ever think about that day at the airport?" The man smiled faintly. "Every day," he said. "It reminds me how little things matter. I didn't do anything big, I just stopped. But somehow everything changed after that." The CEO nodded slowly. "You're wrong about one thing," he said. "You did something big. You made me see what I had forgotten." The man smiled, but his expression carried humility. "Maybe we both learned something," he replied softly. Just then, the door opened, and the little girl ran in, waving her small notebook filled with scribbles of sign language drawings. "Look what I learned today," she said proudly, showing them. The CEO laughed and clapped, then signed "Good job" with his hands. The girl's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't realized he knew how to sign so well. She looked at his mother sitting nearby and ran to hug her. The old woman hugged her back, signing slowly to the child, "You have a kind heart. Never lose it." The room felt warm, a small, quiet harmony between generations and strangers who had somehow become family. As time went on, the foundation began expanding to other cities. The CEO wanted to make sure no one felt invisible, the way his mother once had at that airport. He spoke at events not about profit or growth, but about the importance of empathy. Every story he shared led back to one thing: how one man's small act of kindness had changed everything. People started calling it the Sign of Hope movement. Billboards appeared across the city showing hands in motion, signing words like love, respect, and together. The campaign wasn't about advertising. It was about reminding people that the world still had goodness if you looked closely. But amid all this progress, the CEO never forgot where it began: with his mother. She had grown older, her steps slower, but her spirit was still strong. Every evening, she and her son would sit together by the window, watching the sunset in silence. He would tell her about his day, and she would listen, smiling softly, signing small words of encouragement. Those moments were his favorite part of the day, the quiet time when he wasn't the CEO, just a son sitting beside his mother. One evening, she signed something that caught him off guard. "You have built something beautiful, my boy. But promise me one thing. Never forget the people who walk quietly through life. They often carry the biggest hearts." He nodded slowly, holding her hand. "I promise," he signed back. A few days later, the foundation planned a big event, a celebration of 1 year since it began. The man and his daughter were invited as special guests. It was going to be a night of gratitude, not luxury. The room was decorated simply, filled with pictures of smiling faces from across the city, people whose lives had been touched by the programs. The CEO's mother sat near the front, dressed in a soft blue shawl, her eyes shining with pride. When the event began, the CEO walked to the stage. The room went quiet. Instead of giving a long speech, he turned to the screen behind him. It began showing a short video, scenes from the past year. The training centers, the classrooms, the people signing joyfully. Then a photo appeared. His mother sitting alone at the airport, her hands folded tightly. The audience gasped softly. The next image showed the man kneeling beside her, signing with her, helping her find her way. The music swelled gently as the story unfolded, from that airport moment to the creation of the foundation. When the video ended, the room was silent. The CEO took a deep breath and said, "This is where it all began. One act of kindness, one moment when someone stopped to see another human being. My mother taught me that kindness never fades, and this man reminded me of it." He looked toward the man sitting in the front row and gestured for him to stand. The crowd applauded, many with tears in their eyes. The man stood shyly, his daughter squeezing his hand. The CEO walked over, hugged him, and signed the words, "Thank you, my friend," the man replied through signs. "We did this together." It was a simple exchange, but it touched everyone in the room. The old woman smiled proudly from her seat. Her hands trembled slightly, but she lifted them to sign something toward the audience. "Be kind. Always." A wave of emotion swept through the crowd. Cameras flashed, but the moment wasn't about fame, it was about feeling. Later that night, after the event ended and most guests had gone, the CEO, his mother, the man, and the little girl sat together on the balcony, looking over the quiet city lights. The air was cool and the night felt peaceful. The little girl looked up at the CEO's mother and asked through her new signs, "Do you think kindness can change the world?" The old woman smiled and signed back, "It already has. You just don't always see it." They all sat in silence for a while, letting her words sink in. The CEO looked at the city below and realized how much his life had transformed. Not because of business, but because of people. His mother, her strength, and the humble man who had reminded him of what it means to truly care. They had all become his greatest teachers. Before leaving, the man thanked the CEO for the opportunity. But the CEO shook his head and said, "No, I should thank you. You showed me what success looks like when it has a heart." The two men exchanged a quiet nod of understanding. No words were needed. They both knew what the other meant. That night, when the CEO's mother went to bed, she smiled as she closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt completely at peace. She had seen her son return to the values she had built their life upon: compassion, humility, and love. The world around her was still noisy and fast, but she knew that somewhere, kindness was growing quietly, just like she always believed it would. As for the man and his daughter, their lives slowly improved. His daughter's education was going well, and she often helped at the foundation, teaching other children basic signs. She had inherited her father's warmth, and every time she used her hands to communicate, people smiled. Sometimes they still talked about the day at the airport. "Do you think that moment was meant to happen?" she would ask. Her father would smile and say, "Maybe it was. Maybe we were both in the right place at the right time." And every time planes flew overhead, he looked up, remembering the woman who had changed his life with nothing but her gentle hands and a thankful smile. That one small moment, a man stopping for a stranger, had grown into something far bigger than any of them could have imagined. A quiet reminder that kindness doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be real. Years had gone by since that quiet moment at the airport, the one that had unknowingly changed so many lives. The city had evolved, and so had the people who lived within it. The foundation that began as a tribute had now become a home for thousands, a place where kindness, understanding, and compassion grew stronger every single day. The CEO's hair had turned slightly gray, but his eyes still carried that same gentle spark. The lines on his face showed years of laughter, challenges, and reflection. He had found peace, the kind that doesn't come from wealth or status, but from knowing you've used your time for something good. His mother was older now, her steps slower, her hair thin and silver, but her smile never faded. She still spent her afternoons at the training center, sitting by the window where sunlight poured in. Everyone there adored her. She was like a grandmother to the staff and trainees, always offering a silent blessing through her hands or a soft nod of encouragement. The man who had once stopped for her at the terminal had become one of the most respected figures in the foundation. His humble heart made people trust him instantly. He still lived simply, still raised his daughter with care, and still carried that quiet kindness that seemed to light up every room he entered. His daughter, now a young woman, had grown into someone her father was deeply proud of. She had followed in his footsteps, working at the foundation, helping the deaf community and teaching sign language to children in local schools. She often said that the day her father helped that old woman was the day their family's story began again. One morning, the CEO invited them to his office for tea. The office was elegant but warm. Photos of smiling faces hung on the walls, not awards or certificates. When they arrived, his mother was already sitting there, her hands resting on the table, eyes bright with recognition when she saw them. The room was filled with warmth before anyone even spoke. The CEO looked at them and said, "It's hard to believe how far we've come since that day." The man smiled and nodded. "It feels like a lifetime ago." The mother reached out, touching her son's arm gently, and signed, "That day was fate. We were meant to meet." Her words, though silent, filled the room. They spent hours talking, sharing stories, laughter, and quiet moments of reflection. The young woman poured tea for everyone, her movements graceful and familiar. Watching her, the CEO felt a wave of gratitude. The world had given him wealth, but it was moments like this that made him feel truly rich. After a while, his mother gestured to her son to help her outside. They walked to the small garden behind the building, where the air smelled of jasmine and fresh earth. The others followed. There was a gentle breeze, and the sunlight danced across the leaves. The old woman sat on a bench beneath a blooming tree. She smiled at everyone and signed slowly, "This is what life should be: quiet, kind, and full of meaning." Her son knelt beside her, his eyes soft. "You made this possible," he signed back. She shook her head gently, smiling. "No, my dear." "He did," she said, pointing at the man who had helped her years ago. The man lowered his head, humbled. "I just did what anyone should do," he said softly. The old woman signed with a small grin. "Then may the world have more people like you." They all laughed quietly. In that moment, something felt complete, as if a circle that began long ago had finally closed. As days passed, life continued peacefully. But time has its way of moving forward, no matter how much we wish to hold on to moments. The old woman's health began to fade slowly. She never complained, never showed pain. She would simply sit by the window watching the sky, her hands resting still. Sometimes she'd call for her son, and they'd talk in signs about simple things. How the flowers were blooming, how the rain smelled, how proud she was of what he had built. One night, she called him into her room. The light was dim and the room was quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock. She smiled up at him and signed, "I'm tired, my son, but my heart is full. He felt a lump rise in his throat. "Rest, Mother," he signed back, his fingers trembling. She reached out, touching his cheek gently. "Promise me," she signed slowly, "that you will keep spreading kindness, not for me, but for those who need it most." He nodded, holding her hand tightly. "I promise." That night she passed away peacefully in her sleep, her face calm, her hands folded over her heart. The news spread through the foundation like a soft wind. Everyone felt it deeply, not just because they loved her, but because her presence had changed them. The funeral was simple, just as she would have wanted. People from all walks of life came: trainees, staff, volunteers, even strangers who had once received help from the foundation. There were no speeches, only signs of gratitude, silent tears, and warm embraces. Her son stood quietly beside her photograph, his eyes filled with emotion but his posture strong. The man who had once met her at the terminal stood near him, his daughter beside him, both signing softly, "Thank you." When it was time to say goodbye, the CEO stepped forward and placed a small white flower beside her photograph. "You taught me to see the world with my heart," he whispered, "and because of that I am who I am today." The days that followed were filled with reflection. The CEO took some time off from work. He visited places his mother had loved: the park where she used to feed birds, the quiet cafe where she liked to sit by the window, and the small terminal where their story began. Standing there, he closed his eyes and remembered that day, how everyone had walked past her, how one man had stopped, and how everything changed from that single moment. He smiled to himself. "Kindness echoes," he whispered. A few months later, the foundation announced a new project, a community center named after his mother. It would serve as a safe space for people who were deaf or hard of hearing, offering free classes, counseling, and training. The grand opening was set for spring. On the day of the opening, the city turned up in full support. The building was simple but beautiful, filled with sunlight and laughter. A small statue stood by the entrance, a pair of hands gently forming the sign for love. The man and his daughter stood beside the CEO as the ribbon was cut. Cameras clicked, but the moment felt personal. The CEO's speech was brief. He said, "My mother believed that love doesn't always need sound. Sometimes it speaks through hands, through actions, through the way we treat one another. Today, we honor that belief." The crowd applauded softly, many signing "thank you" toward the sky. As the guests explored the center, the young woman walked up to the CEO and handed him a small notebook. Inside were drawings of hands forming different signs, ones she had created over the years. On the last page, she had drawn a picture of an older woman smiling, with the words written beneath, "The world still listens, even when it's quiet." The CEO looked at her, deeply moved. "Your father raised you well," he said. She smiled, glancing toward her father across the room. "He learned from your mother," she replied. That evening, when everyone had gone home, the CEO sat alone in the garden behind the new center. The lights from the city glimmered in the distance. He felt the breeze brush against his face and looked up at the night sky. For a moment, he imagined his mother sitting beside him, her hands resting softly on her lap, her eyes full of peace. He smiled and signed slowly toward the stars. "We did it, Mother." The story that began with silence had ended in a harmony that words could never fully describe. In the following years, the Sign of Hope centers spread across different cities. Thousands of people found new beginnings there, learning, healing, and rediscovering their worth. And at the heart of every center, on the wall near the entrance, hung the same phrase in sign and text: "One act of kindness can change everything." It became a reminder to everyone who walked through those doors that compassion is not about grand gestures, but about seeing someone when no one else does. The man and his daughter continued to work with the foundation for many years. She eventually became one of its lead trainers, inspiring children to communicate through signs, art, and love. Her father often said that he was proud not of what they achieved, but of how they achieved it, with grace, humility, and kindness. As for the CEO, he never stopped visiting the centers no matter how busy life became. He didn't come as a leader, but as a listener, always sitting with people, learning from their stories, sharing quiet smiles. And every time he saw someone helping another person, someone stopping to care, to listen, or to reach out, he saw a reflection of that one day at the terminal. Because sometimes, The loudest stories begin in silence, and sometimes the simplest gesture, a touch on the shoulder, a wordless smile, a hand reaching out, becomes the start of something the world never forgets. And that's how it all began, and how it will always continue, one act of kindness at a time.